At exactly 2:17 a.m., when Helena, Montana was wrapped in deep winter silence, and the streets outside the emergency call center were buried under snow that muted every sound, a 911 call lit up dispatcher Emily Carter's screen with a warning she almost never saw. And no caller ID and no location, and no carrier data, just a red blinking alert that immediately made her uneasy, because calls like that usually meant something had already gone terribly wrong. Emily adjusted her headset, took a steady breath, and answered in the calm, rehearsed tone she had mastered over 7 years on the job. 911, what's your emergency? But instead of a scream, a cry, or frantic words, the line answered her with breathing. Slow, uneven breathing, thick and wet, like air being pulled through lungs that weren't working properly. Each inhale stretching just a little too long, before collapsing into a shaky exhale, followed by a faint sound in the background that reminded Emily of fingers tapping softly against a hard surface. She waited a moment, then repeated herself, louder this time, and after a pause so long she thought the call might drop, a male voice finally emerged, quiet, trembling, exhausted rather than panicked, as if fear had already done its damage hours ago, whispering, "Please, I need help. He's inside the house." Emily straightened instantly, fingers hovering over her keyboard as she marked it as a potential home invasion, and asked the man to identify who he was and where he was calling from, but the caller didn't respond right away. And during that silence, the tapping sound had turned, slower now, joined by something heavier, a dragging noise that scraped across the floor and sent a cold shiver down Emily's spine. When the man spoke again, his voice dropped to an almost inaudible whisper, like he was afraid of being heard, saying, "I'm hiding in the basement. It's dark down here and cold, and I can hear him walking upstairs." And Emily felt her heart rate spike as she urged him to find an exit, a window, anything. But instead of answering like a terrified victim, the man let out a short, broken laugh that sounded wrong, hollow, before whispering words that made Emily's breath catch in her throat. "Upstairs, my body is lying on the floor." She froze, convinced she had misheard him, asking him to repeat that. Telling herself shock could make people say strange things, but the man repeated it slowly, clearly, carefully, as if each word mattered. "My body is upstairs, not moving." I try to wake it up, but it won't listen. And suddenly the room felt too small, the glow of the monitors too bright, the hum of computers too loud, as Emily forced herself to stay professional, asking if he was injured, asking if anyone else was in the house, asking questions that no longer felt grounded in reality. Instead of answering directly, the man began describing the house in detail, details he should not have been able to see from a basement. Talking about a lamp knocked over beside the couch, a family photograph shattered on the floor, a dark stain spreading slowly across the beige carpet beneath the body upstairs. And Emily's hand started to shake, because these were not vague guesses. They were precise observations, specific and chillingly calm. She told him help was on the way, even though she still couldn't get a location. And that's when the breathing on the line changed, becoming slower, heavier, closer to the microphone, until it felt like the man was leaning directly into her ear, whispering, "Please don't let them open the door. If they open it, he'll notice." And Emily demanded to know who he was, her voice cracking despite years of training. But the man ignored the question and said something that made her stomach turn. "He's wearing my face, but it doesn't fit him right," followed by a wet sound, like lips peeling away from teeth. Emily's screen flickered suddenly, and for a brief second a partial location tried to populate before vanishing again, an address fragment that led nowhere. And when she begged a man to keep talking, to stay with her, he spoke calmly, almost peacefully, saying words that did not belong in a 911 call. "I think I died down here, but something else stood up," and then the dragging noise grew louder, closer, joined by slow, deliberate footsteps overhead, each step creaking through the house like a countdown. Emily opened her mouth to speak again, but the man cut her off, his whisper now tight with fear, urgency seeping through for the first time, saying, "He's standing over the body now. He's smiling. He knows I'm calling you." And just before the line disconnected completely, leaving only dead static, he said one final sentence so quiet she almost missed it, a warning that lodged itself deep into her mind and refused to leave. If this call doesn't end, it means he's listening too. The moment the call disconnected, Emily Carter sat frozen in her chair, headset still pressed against her ears, as if the man's breathing might suddenly return, because in 7 years as a dispatcher she had handled shootings, suicides, home invasions, and dying voices, but nothing that felt like this. Nothing that crawled under her skin and stayed there. And even though protocol demanded she move on to the next incoming call, her eyes remained locked on the empty screen where the caller's data should have been. The space blank, as if the system itself had refused to acknowledge what had just spoken through it. Her supervisor, Mark Reynolds, noticed immediately that something was wrong and walked over, asking what happened. But when Emily tried to explain, the words sounded wrong even in her own ears, fragmented and unreal, describing a man who claimed his body was upstairs while he hid in a basement, describing a voice that didn't sound alive. And Mark's expression shifted from concern to disbelief to unease when he replayed the partial audio log and heard the breathing for himself, slow and deliberate, followed by the whispering voice that made even him swallow hard. Against Emily's protests, protocol was followed and law enforcement was dispatched to the partial location that had flickered on her screen moments before the call dropped. A sealed residential address on the outskirts of Helena, a house officially abandoned and condemned 14 years earlier after a gas explosion killed its owners, a place that should not have had working phone lines or power. The officers arrived 20 minutes later to a property buried in snow, the windows boarded up, the front door chained shut from the outside, and yet when they forced their way in, they found fresh footprints leading inside, pressed deep into the snow as if someone had walked in barefoot and never walked out. Inside the house, the air was stale and thick with rot, the smell of decay clinging to every surface. And in the living room, exactly as the caller had described, they found a body sprawled on the floor near the couch, a man in his mid-30s, eyes open, mouth frozen in a silent scream, his face twisted in terror so raw it unsettled even seasoned officers. And beneath him the carpet was dark and soaked, the stain long dried at the edges but still tacky at the center, indicating he had been dead for days. There were no signs of forced entry, no weapon nearby, no struggle marks beyond deep scratches along the walls leading toward the basement door, as if someone or something had clawed at the plaster in a desperate attempt to climb upward. When the officers descended into the basement, weapons drawn, they found nothing living, only deep gouge marks in the concrete floor, long drag trails circling the room again and again, and in the far corner, something that made them radio for backup immediately. A cell phone, old and cracked, still warm to the touch, its screen shattered but faintly glowing with a single open call log. The last number dialed, 911. Back at the call center, Emily listened in horror as the coroner's preliminary report came through hours later, confirming what she already felt in her bones. The man had been dead for at least 3 days, with no measurable cause of death beyond extreme cardiac failure, as if his heart had simply stopped under unbearable fear. Emily tried to convince herself it was coincidence, trauma-induced hallucination, some bizarre prank layered over tragedy. But none of those explanations could account for phones still being warm, or the fact that the basement showed signs of recent movement, even though no one had entered the house in over a decade. That night, Emily went home early, her nerves shot, the man's words replaying over and over in her head. I think I died down here, but something else stood up, and she barely slept, waking repeatedly to the sound of slow breathing that she swore wasn't her own. The next evening, just before her shift began, she was called into Mark's office again, where he looked pale and shaken, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled up a new audio file and told her there had been another call, log at 2:17 a.m. exactly, originating from the same sealed address. But this time something was wrong, because the dispatcher listed on the call record was Emily herself, even though she had been at home, asleep, with her phone turned off. Emily laughed nervously, insisting it was a system error, until Mark pressed play, and the sound of her own voice filled the room, calm, professional, unmistakable, repeating the same words she had spoken 1,000 times before. 911, what's your emergency? Followed by a pause, then breathing, slow, wet, deliberate breathing identical to the night before, and then a whisper she recognized instantly, the same man's voice, saying, I'm still in the basement, while her recorded voice responded in perfect rhythm, asking questions she didn't remember asking, guiding the call exactly the way she would have. Emily's knees weakened as the recording continued, because now a third sound had joined the audio, a faint, almost playful humming in the background, low and distorted, not human. And when the caller spoke again, his voice was calmer, steadier, as if fear no longer touched him, saying, "He's learning how to talk now. He likes your voice." And the call ended with a sentence that made Emily's blood run cold because it was spoken in her own tone, but with words she had never said. "You should have let the door stay closed." Emily Carter stopped going home after the second recording, not because anyone told her to, but because every time she stepped inside her apartment, the silence felt wrong, thick and watchful, as if the air itself was waiting for her to speak first. And so she slept on the couch in her sister's living room with the lights on, convincing herself that exhaustion and stress were twisting her thoughts. That hearing her own voice on that recording had shaken something loose in her mind, but no amount of logic could explain why. At exactly 2:17 a.m. every night, her phone screen lit up without a notification, glowing faintly as if a call was trying to come through, but never quite connecting. On the fourth night after the body was found, Emily returned to work despite Mark's insistence that she take extended leave, because sitting at home felt worse than sitting in the call center, and the familiar rhythm of incoming emergencies gave her something solid to hold on to, something human, until the clock crept closer to 2:17, and she realized with tightening chest that no matter how hard she tried to ignore it, she was counting down the seconds. When the time came, the room grew unnaturally quiet, as if all the other operators had collectively stopped breathing, and then her screen flickered once before lighting up with a call that bypassed the queue entirely. Overriding active emergencies, flashing a label that made her stomach drop. Dispatcher line, internal source. Mark noticed at the same time and shouted for her not to answer. But Emily's hand moved on its own, muscle memory overriding fear as she pressed a button and brought the headset to her ear, and immediately the sound filled her head. Breathing, slow and familiar, closer than ever, followed by a soft, satisfied sigh. "Emily," the voice said, no longer whispering, no longer afraid, "you're finally listening." And she tried to speak, to ask who or what it was, but her throat locked as the voice continued, calm and patient, explaining things the way someone explains rules to a child, telling her that when the man died in the basement, fear hollowed him out so completely that something else had room to move in, something that learned by wearing him, walking in his shape upstairs, learning how to smile, how to stand, how to speak, and most importantly, how to call for help. The voice told her that 911 lines were special, that they were doors people opened willingly, doors that carried panic, pain, and last words, and that every time Emily answered one, she made the door a little wider without realizing it, feeding it pieces of herself. Her voice, her calm, her empathy, until it no longer needed the man's face anymore. Around her, the call center lights dimmed slightly, monitors flickering as if struggling to hold a signal, and Emily realized a growing horror that the other dispatchers were frozen in place, eyes open, unmoving, like mannequins paused mid-breath, while the voice spoke only to her. "I couldn't stay in the basement forever," it said gently, "but you let me climb." And suddenly Emily remembered the scratches on the walls, the drag marks, the way the thing had described the house so clearly, not because it could see, but because it had been practicing remembering what it was like to be human. Her headset crackled and the audio shifted, filling with layered sounds. Hundreds of overlapping emergency calls. Cries for help, final gasps, prayers, screams, all bleeding together into a low, pulsing hum that made her head ache. And the voice told her those were the ones that never made it, the calls that ended too soon, the people who died mid-sentence, leaving their fear behind like open wounds. "They don't go anywhere," it said almost kindly. "They stay on the line." And Emily felt tears slide down her face as she realized what it was doing, what it had been doing since the first night, learning how to answer back. The voice shifted again, and suddenly it was her voice speaking to her, calm, reassuring, professional, telling her help was on the way, telling her to stay on the line, telling her everything would be okay, and the sound of herself saying those words felt more terrifying than any scream. Mark lunged to the console, trying to cut the call manually, but every system command failed, overridden by something that knew the architecture better than any human, and as alarms began to blare uselessly in the background, the voice lowered to a whisper meant only for Emily. "I don't need basement anymore," it said. "I don't need houses." And she felt a cold pressure behind her eyes as images flooded her mind. Endless lines ringing the dark, thousands of open doors, voices answering voices. Fear feeding fear. "I just need someone to pick up," it continued. and you always do. Emily's vision blurred as she felt herself being pulled inward, not physically, but through sound, through memory, through every call she had ever answered, every moment she had leaned close to listen, and in her final moment of clarity, she understood that this was why the recording used her voice so perfectly, because it was already practicing wearing her. The call ended abruptly. The light snapped back on, and the other dispatchers gasped as if waking from a shared dream. But Emily was no longer in her chair, her headset lying empty on the desk. The screen still glowed with a completed call log stamped at 2:17 a.m. with no caller ID. Weeks later, new dispatchers were warned about a strange glitch in the system, a voice that sometimes answered before they did, calm and familiar. And if you ever dial 911 late at night and hear a woman say, "Please stay on the line," you should hang up immediately, because Emily is still working, and whatever learned to wear her never stops listening.